Hello and welcome back to Model Railroading 101. I'm your host John, and today I'm going to talk to you about operations. One of the things I started hearing about as I delved more deeply into the various aspects of model railroading was op sessions. You may also recall I published a video about my very first op session experience here on the channel about a year ago. I was a little surprised that there's even more than just building a layout, adding scenery, building the models, customizing them, making them light up, giving them a sound, weathering them, super detailing, and all that stuff. Operations is just one more way to enjoy the hobby. So let's talk about operations for just a minute. What does it really mean? Operations in model railroading is what it's called when you run a model railroad in a way that's similar to how a prototype railroad runs or ran. That means you have various jobs for people to fulfill. You adhere to rules similar to the prototype, and of course, operate the trains on the layout in a way that's consistent with how the prototype runs or ran. Part of my research for this video included asking dozens of people I know about operating, and some of what we'll talk about stems from that correspondence. One of the great things about talking to people about things like this is that you don't have to take 10 years to become an expert in order to understand the insight that someone else may have garnered from that kind of experience. And for this, I thank everyone who responded to my inquiry. You know who you are, and I appreciate your feedback very much. Not only did I end up talking with people about this topic, but I also was lucky enough to have books and other material offered to me for this subject matter for the program. And it turns out that a lot of the guys I know are very much into operating, and they're so passionate about this aspect of the hobby that they've also offered their expertise and in some cases even their layouts to discuss and explain some of the principles that we'll be covering on this subject. Seth Neumann appeared on a layout tour fairly recently with his Union Pacific Oakland sub HO scale layout. Seth has traveled all over the country for operating events and has been involved with the Operations Special Interest Group, or OPSIG, for a long time. I consider him one of the most knowledgeable people I know on this subject, and he was kind enough to offer his expertise to explain more about this topic on camera. So let's head over to Seth's place and we'll see what he has to say about it.
Hi, I'm Seth Neumann, and we're here to talk a little bit about operations. Operations is really modeling the jobs of the railroad. And if you built a layout and you've watched the train run around it once or twice, now it's time to think about how to make the layout operate as a model of a railroad, rather than just a bunch of models of pieces of railroad equipment. I've been in the operations part of the model railroad hobby for over 20 years, and I was also involved in the founding of the Operations Special Interest Group and was a director for several years and at one point the vice president of the Operations SIG. I mention that because OPSIG has an excellent magazine, maintains a website, and is a great resource to go if you want to learn more about operations. So, when we talk about operations and modeling the jobs of the railroad, it begs the question, what do you want to do? There are several kinds of jobs that we generally like to do. We like to run trains. Many of us like to dispatch the railroad, which is manage the flow of trains on the railroad. There are other traffic management, if you will, jobs, running towers, which are busy intersections of different rail lines. Then there's also the issues of managing traffic. These are car forwarding. You may have heard of car cards or switch lists. So these are things that tell the train crews how to move or where to move the cars. And then there's a whole set of jobs you may want to do which have to do with driving the traffic, managing the traffic that moves across the railroad. When we have a model railroad, usually we're trying to tell a story, and one of the questions is, how does this railroad make its living? What does this railroad do? A mainline railroad might be involved in hauling traffic from a major port city that has export traffic and serves a large metropolitan area. And it may run off over the mountains into someplace in the interior where it's going to pick up agricultural commodities or minerals and bring them back for processing and ship goods out to the countryside for people living there. So that would be modeling something like the Baltimore and Ohio or the C&O. On the other hand, you might have a little branch line where you go up to a quarry in the mountains at the end of the railroad, and you come down through an agricultural area which might have packing houses. They might operate seasonally. You might also be shipping goods out to the town. This is the period before roads were good. So, mail and packages, all the things we get from FedEx today, would be coming in on the train. So now we have a story. We have kind of a railroad that we're modeling, and the question is, how are we going to manage that railroad? Certainly for the mainline railroad, and to a lesser extent for even the branch line railroad, one of the questions is going to be, what does the transportation plan look like? What does the railroad generally do to manage its traffic? And in the example of a railroad connecting major cities, well, the first thing to consider is passenger trains, because typically business people will want to leave town at the end of the business day after they've done their business. They'll get on a train, probably a sleeper, and travel overnight and want to be arriving in their destination city rested and ready to get to work in the morning. So the passenger trains typically will want to run overnight between the major cities. We may also have some priority freight traffic. It might be perishables, and they might come in from the field at the end of the day, and the various icing and packing operations will take place, and they'll be leaving sometime in the middle of the night, but the idea is to get out of town before the commuter rush starts in the morning and be on their way to the east. So, for example, if you were modeling Salinas in California, you might have a pattern that looked like that. You'd get that freight out of the Bay Area, past the commute traffic, and on its way up to Roseville and then to Ogden early in the morning. Now, after those time freights and passenger trains, where the timing is critical, have gone, there's through freights, freight trains that are going to be carrying cars a long distance, and depending on where you are on the railroad, that will tell you about what time to expect those trains. What's left are lower class trains, typically extras, locals, and those will typically come out when there's nothing else on the railroad, unless there's a particular industry that needs to be switched at a particular time. So as you do this, you start to build up a schedule of when the railroad's going to be used for particular purposes, and then you can get formal and build a schedule. In scheduling, there's all sorts of techniques, typically graphs or string charts, and it ends up in something that looks like a timetable, and that will tell the employees when to expect which train. So now we've defined our railroad, and we've worked out a transportation plan. That is, we understand what sorts of trains are going to be run when. But there are certain kinds of jobs that need to be done on pretty much any railroad. And the details of how that's done and how many people need to do those will vary somewhat with the layout and with the style of operation. But generally, we're going to have a certain set of jobs. And the first one that comes to mind, of course, is running a train. So trains will have engineers who typically are concerned with driving the engine, and they'll have conductors who tend to be more involved with decisions around what cars to move and where to move them and in what order to do the work. So you can think of the engineer as the driver and the conductor as the captain of the ship who's making those decisions. Depending on how you do this, there may be other jobs involved also. Another obviously important function is deciding which train runs when. Schedule's nice, but no battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy, and we have to be able to adjust to handle real conditions and day-to-day variations in traffic and trains breaking down and various other things. And that's typically handled by the dispatcher. The dispatcher is responsible for being the traffic cop of the railroad. Then we have issues having to do with car movement. Some of them are handled by the conductor on the train, but we also have yard masters and clerks who are responsible for the overall routing of cars across the railroad. So when a train arrives at a yard and there are cars within that train going to different destinations, the yard master is responsible for figuring out which cars go where, taking cars that are leaving that train off, perhaps adding others in, and getting cars organized so that local trains can go out and work them. And depending on how busy the yard is, there may be a couple of switch jobs that work for that yard master, and there may be a clerk who is actually the person specifically responsible for determining which cars go on to which train. So you can do this from a very small yard with one crewman who does the job of switching and figuring out where the cars are going, up to there are model railroads with the yard master, 3 or 4 switch jobs, and a clerk or two. And it could be as many as 8 or 10 people, and it becomes a little bit of a real management job. Finally, there are, depending on the style of operations, people along the road who are responsible for handling the routing of trains as it travels across the road under direction of the dispatcher. And these may be what are called operators, people who handle messages to the trains telling them to modify their instructions, stop and wait to meet someone at a different place perhaps. And on busier railroads, there will be what are called tower operators who handle intersections between different railroads. They're typically referred to as interlocking plants. And each of these tower men will have the job of conveying messages to the crews as the trains move across the railroad and actually controlling the switches and directing the route the train will take. Of course, it's all a model railroad, and we rarely have the luxury of modeling the railroad one-to-one. So even though we're compressed, we will not have 10 scale miles of track between towns. We try to keep the interesting bits and remove the boring ones, and we call that selective compression. And we do the same thing with operations. There are many, many jobs in the railroad. During the transition era, there were 10 clerks for every person in train service or engine service. So what we think of as the fun throttle jobs, there would be, a room outside if we had a 10-man crew of 100 clerks. So we probably wouldn't find 100 people willing to give up their Thursday night to be clerks. So we try to compress that, the boring stuff and the dangerous stuff and the dirty stuff out and keep the fun jobs in. So what we usually end up with are engineers and conductors running locals, probably a combination engineer-conductor for through trains, dispatchers, yard masters, and some degree of yard crew, as we talked about earlier. One of the things that we do in operations, of course, is try to simulate car movement. Now, understand there are some types of trains which are what we call unit trains. Typically, a group of coal cars may leave a mine, and they will run directly to a power plant, run around a loop, dump their coal, and head back to the mine on a 3 or 4 day cycle, and they'll never be switched unless a car breaks or something like that. And we'll have a certain number of trains that behave that way on our models. Commuters are perhaps another one. You don't typically change the consist of a commuter passenger train. But for most other trains, there is some switching. Now, either it's groups of cars called blocks or single cars. And we have to have some way to tell our crews how to handle those. So there's a number of schemes that have arisen over the years, some more prototypical than others. Probably the most common car forwarding scheme in model railroading is what we call car cards and waybills. So in that case, we have a little card for each car, and it tells you the road name of the car and its number, and perhaps some other information like the type of car. And there's one of these cards for each car. And within that, we place what we call a waybill. And the waybill tells us, again, what kind of car the commodity is going in, but it also tells us what train it's going on, what city it's going to, and who the consignee is, the person who's getting or the business receiving the commodity. Then we stick the card in here, and you can see which card it is, SP, what is this, 465014, and it has a 34-foot hopper, and it's going to Ready Mix in Niles, California. Now, when we get to where it's going, you flip the card over to the next destination. It's called a 4-cycle waybill because there's 2 sides and 2 halves, and that makes 4. And let's say the next version or the next destination would be 3. And, let's see, this one is going to go to Radom, California, to Kaiser Sand and Gravel to get some more sand and gravel. And it's going to be on the 54 local. So this gives us routing information, tells us who's getting it, where they are, and what train to put them on. So this is a fairly simple scheme, and you just keep flipping the cards over, and it's more or less a perpetual routing. You'll continue to move that around. There's lots of variations on this. For one thing, you don't have to use all 4 cycles. In that coal mine train, it would just be go to the mine, go back to the power plant, go to the mine, and you might even say, well, I know this is a block of 20 cars, so you just have some way to list, there's a whole block of cars, not just one. And again, there's a number of variations to handle that. So that's the car card and waybill system, or the 4-cycle system, or the McFall waybill system, after the first guy to write an article about it in the Railroad Press. And works pretty well. If you're a regular operator, you'll be very familiar with this because probably half the railroads use it, maybe more. Another general scheme for this is prototypical waybills, and our friend Tony Thompson has really been a leader in this. And what Tony tried to do, and I don't have an example with me right now, is to make a real waybill. He scanned hundreds of waybills from prototype railroads in the transition era, and used the general form of it, simplified it a little bit, and made a little card, again about this size, and you just stick it in a baseball card sleeve, and it's a single document, so it tells you the car number, where it's going, and so on and so forth. And you can either use a computer system to generate these for one-time use, so every session you just print up a bunch of new ones, or you recycle them because, frankly, most industries receive the same type of cars pretty regularly, and given the size of our collection, you can cycle that around, and it's fairly manageable. The more manual you want to get, it's probably more suitable for a smaller switching layout. For larger mainline railroads with hundreds and hundreds of cars, the car card and waybill scheme it's a little easier to manage. So it's just a question of what your emphasis is. Another way to manage this is to have switch lists. Now, there's a little question about where did the information for the switch list come from, but in terms of what you give the crew, if you don't want people carrying stacks of cards around and having to organize them, you can have the yardmaster or clerk write out a switch list. And the switch list looks something like this. This is a fairly simple one that I use. At the top, it tells you some basic information about the train. Where's it coming from, which is Milpitas in this case. What's the train number? This is the LRV 54 local. The date, well, in this case, we're going to assume it's March 21st of 1999, which is the year I model. And it's engine number 559. Now, the 54 local is going to have a number of cars in here. I've just filled a couple out. They are Southern Pacific 45014, which is a hopper, and it's from Milpitas to Kaiser Sand and Gravel. And these can be abbreviated and frequently are. The next car is a least covered hopper, ACFX 72019, and it's type is LO, which for historical reasons is covered hopper. I know that makes sense. I always think of covered hopper when I see LO. And it's going to a transload facility, which is basically a parking lot with a bunch of railroad tracks in it and driveways for trucks to come up in between. And so some truck is going to come up at this place called Snowboy, which is a repurposed old packing house, and they're going to blow a bunch of plastic pellets out of this hopper into the truck and drive it over to the NUMMI automobile plant and make dashboards out of it. And so on and so forth. And, in this case, I've got room for 30 cars, which is a lot longer than any train on my layout. So we talked about writing switch lists manually, which is a great solution for the crews because they have a lot less paperwork. Now, you might be asking, why don't you just do it on a computer? And the answer is lots of people, like the prototype railroads, do exactly that. And as modelers, we're kind of blessed because there's a number of good products that let us do it. So we ran a segment here on JMRI operations, or JMRI ops as it's known, and that's an excellent product for giving lists to crews so that they know what to do on the road. A question that raises is, well, where does the underlying data that tells you which industries go to various cars and when do you move them? And in the case of JMRI Ops, it's stored in tables in the program. In my case, it's actually a rack of car cards that the clerk handles manually, and that's called a perpetual inventory car location system, or a pickle rack. The clerk is responsible for managing where the cars actually go in the trains, and he does that with switch lists and a series of car cards, which really serves as the database for where the cars are and where they're going. So this is called a perpetual inventory car locator, or PICL, P-I-C-L, system, and we refer to this series of pigeonholes as a pickle rack. And you notice that each slot in the pickle rack corresponds to a location on the railroad. The sand spur at Kaiser Sand and Gravel. In Pleasanton we have the team track, Rickert Lumber, Villa Armando Winery, and so forth. Then over on this side we have through trains and various staging slots, and we have another little area up here for trains that are actually out on the layout. So this represents where the cars are, if they're in a train where they are, and once the train is run, where we expect the trains to be. In fact, usually when a car has gotten to its final location, the clerk will turn that card around, which says, I don't need to worry about it any further for this session. Now he has a couple of other tools that we'll talk about very briefly. One is a rack of switch lists, so you can write them out by hand and give instructions to crews. We also have a radio frequency identification system which tags cars as they come into the yard. So in the case that we have a whole train coming in, the car numbers and road names are already filled out for you. He's also got a quick cheat sheet of job descriptions of the trains, so he understands what sort of cars would be on which train, and a list of trains by yard arrival time. So this one is listing, for example, that the NUMMI 1 will be at the NUMMI plant when the session starts, and he will probably come back on the lead. He will be powered by the UP 559, and he's supposed to be out at 8 a.m. So he's got that list, and that gives the clerk the sequence of expected work and allows him to keep the yard prioritized for the next train to happen. A couple of aids to keeping things organized are dividers, which are made of 16th-inch styrene, and labels that just label the name of the train or the location that cars are going to. So if you need to hold out a couple of cars, then you would just stick them behind the divider and you now have a mnemonic for where these things are going. We also keep some spare cards that are usually, or spare waybills, that we usually use between sessions if we need to balance a train. For example, the cars aren't going where we need them, so we simply just generate some new waybills and drop them in. And there's a pocket or two full of those and a pocket full of spare labels. So the system is fairly easy to use. It's manual. We don't need to interact with the computer during the system unless we're using one of the RFID generated lists. And even then, we don't really interact with it. We just have the list and we fill in the list. So the idea is not so much to make it a computer tending job as to use the computer to reduce some of the more repetitive things like giving yourself carpal tunnel writing switch lists. Now that we've figured out how to move cars from spots onto trains and trains back into yards, we've built some trains up and we're ready to move them across the railroad. Well, we don't want to just send them out across the railroad without checking, because they're likely to run into another train, and that's not good in either the prototype or on the model. So there's several styles of dispatching we can think about using. The simplest is what I would call informal, sometimes known as Mother May I. In that case, when you have a train assembled and you're ready to get out on the main, you call or yell at or use a radio to contact dispatcher or the owner, whoever's running the session, and explain that you're at the yard at Anna and you would like to move to the yard at Bess. And typically the informal dispatcher will take a look and see if anybody's coming and say, okay, you're cleared to move from Anna to Bess, and call me when you get there. And that's fine. I mean, the object is simply not to run into anybody. The owner may be running around and telling the yardmaster at best not to let another train out until you've arrived. And again, this is a good scheme for early operations. You don't need to do a lot of development of formal paperwork or a schedule. The point is just to get trains out and running, understand what's going to fit where, what sort of trains are likely to be, contending for the same space, and working out a solution. So it's a great learning and planning tool, even if you don't intend to operate the railroad that way forever. And on the other hand, there are groups that, have operated every Friday night for the last 20 years doing that, and they're perfectly happy with it. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. The next thing most modelers progress to is a fairly modern style of dispatching, which I would refer to as verbal authorities. And these are more formalized systems that are based on prototype practice. This came in around 1986 in the U.S. under the G-Corps, General Code of Operating Rules. And those are a series of schemes known as track warrant control, direct traffic control, and their Canadian cousin, occupancy control systems. And what these were really designed to do is take advantage of the fact that radio had become sufficiently reliable that you could dispatch a railroad on radio. And these are fairly simple check-the-box type forms where typically a train is given exclusive authority to a section of track between certain limits. Now, depending on which one you use, it can either be a predefined block, which, of course, if you're just coming off a DC railroad where you had blocks, this is perfect. You've been given a gift. There's a formal scheme for saying, from this point to that point, you have a block, the Anna block. And while you're in the Anna block, nobody else can use it until you relinquish it. A slightly more flexible version in the U.S. is called track warrant control. And in track warrant control, you can grant authority to a piece of track between any two named points, although in modern practice, it's generally between two mileposts, because they're unambiguous. There's just no question as to where you are if you are at all familiar with the railroad. But you can give authority from the Deer Creek Bridge to the West Los Molinos switch. That's fine. I just did that yesterday on a friend's railroad. On my railroad, it would be something like from milepost 30.2 to milepost 38.0 on the Oakland sub. Now, we've since gone to CTC on my railroad, but that type of formulation is just fine. And typically you would give the dispatcher a map of the railroad. Typically it's magnetic with markers, and you just move markers with the train name along, and that's a fairly good way to keep track of authorities that have been given. There are some wrinkles. You can certainly say, come up to a particular point and you can't move until a particular train has arrived. So it might be Xbox 2 proceed from Las Molinas to Sambone on the South Main, Xbox 7 not in effect until after the arrival of another train at Sambone. So basically he can't leave Sambone until the opposing train has passed, and then he's free to proceed down to yard limits. That kind of formulation is supported. And people have made various modifications. The real railroads have too. And you can use that to control a fairly high density railroad, usually used with radios. Typically family radio service, FRS radios are used in model railroading. As traffic increased on railroads, it became kind of inefficient to copy orders manually, and we'll get to timetable and train order in a moment, but verbal authorities are an example. At a certain number of new warrants per hour, the amount of chatter on the radio becomes unmanageable. So the railroads were faced with this problem as early as the 1930s, and they started to develop systems that used signals rather than to simply space trains so that they didn't run into one another, which is, very important. Lives were at stake, and a great deal of property was not damaged as a result of these systems. But they also began to actually give trains authority to occupy track with signals. And these are generally lumped under the category of centralized traffic control, which was actually a brand name like Kleenex at one time for one of the manufacturers. But the idea is, from the crew's perspective, if you see a green signal, it means it's clear, you can continue at track speed. A yellow signal means there is a non-clear signal, or you are about to go off on a lower speed route ahead, so you need to slow down, sometimes called approach. And then there's stop, which would be a red signal. So very much like driving a car, except yellow means slow down and prepare to stop, not go like hell before it turns red. Essentially, in centralized traffic control, authority is conveyed by signals. A variation of this that was used actually a little bit earlier and very popular on eastern roads where they had double track mains was to have two tracks, each of which had a direction of traffic. So there was an eastbound track, typically the right-hand track as you looked at it, and a westbound track, also right-hand as you're coming from the east towards the west. And in these systems, once you had a clearance or a form to get out on the railroad at all, you simply followed the signals ahead of you. If a train ahead of you slowed down, you would start to see yellow signals and you would slow down. And if you saw a red signal, you would stop. This was called current of traffic, or Rule 251 operation. Rule 251 usually also involved manned towers, which had sets of controls called interlocking plants, where trains could be switched between adjacent tracks and off onto branch lines and so forth. And in a 251 railroad, about every 10 miles you'd have a tower. So, but from the crew's perspective, the important thing about all of these is you just followed the lights, and that's how you got your authority. The other method of train control, or style of dispatching that you've probably heard of, is timetable and train order. And there's a great deal of mystique about it because the rules are a little bit different from the others, but it's actually fundamentally not terribly difficult. In the earliest days, there were timetables, but because the railroads didn't have telegraphs, they existed before telephone and telegraph, you didn't really know if a train was coming. And the way you could deal with that problem was to simply have a rigid timetable where every train had a particular time to be at a station, and if an opposing train got to the station and the train they were supposed to meet wasn't there. They just waited until it did show up because they didn't want to take the risk that the train would go off and then run into the opposing train on the road. That would have been very bad. So the railroads, as you might imagine, were among the earliest users of the telegraph, which is the first electronic communication we had. And one day, the superintendent of I think it was the part of the New York Central, Charles Minot, was doing a check ride, riding along with an engineer, and he got to a station, and they waited, and the opposing train didn't show up, and the opposing train didn't show up, and Mr. Minot got a little bit impatient and went down and asked the operator in the office, "Where's the other train?" "Well, I don't know." "So why don't you call ahead to the other stations and see where the train is?" And it turned out the opposing train was 2 or 3 stations to the west and had broken down. So Mr. Minot said, "Well, tell you what, you send him a message, hold the train until I get there." And he climbed back up on the cab, and he told the engineer to get going because the other train was waiting for them 3 stations down. And the engineer said, "Well, the rules said I can't." And Mr. Minot said, "Well, get out of the driver's seat and I'll drive." And he had written a note with his initials as superintendent, and to this, or till the very end of train order in the late 1900s, I think the last railroad running timetable and train order was the Long Island Railroad around 1998. Train orders were always signed by the superintendent of the division. So the engineer went along for the ride. Mr. Minot drove the train. They got to the station where the opposing train was broken down and proceeded on their way. So that's the basic idea of timetable and train order. There's a timetable, and there are first-class trains that have priority over second-class trains, and there are schedules, and basically the superior train follows its schedule, and if a superior train is late, the inferior trains have to wait. And if you want to run an extra train which doesn't have a schedule, or if you want to modify the schedule of a scheduled train, you write a train order to modify the timetable. So it's timetable, which is primary, and train order, which modifies the timetable. The essential scheme isn't that complicated, and it does mean that the crews need to consider their orders, consider the time, and look out for other trains. And a lot of people find that this is a great dimension, that it adds to their operating, and it can be a great deal of fun. A third area that people are concerned with in terms of modeling prototypical operations is what I would call prototypical locomotive operation. So these would be things at the simplest form would be remembering to blow twice when you start moving, 3 times when you're backing, blowing for grade crossings, running the bell when you're passing men and equipment working or approaching a station. And with the modern sound-equipped locomotives we have, that's fairly easy to do. Another theme there that's a little more advanced, but that's come forward quite a bit recently, is simulating the dynamics of the train. And this has really been driven by a number of modelers who had experience as professional railroaders. And what they have been doing is using throttles that simulate the dynamics, the amount of time it takes a train to stop and slow down. They're able to simulate the weight of the train so that you're having to, rather than just turn the throttle up and down, you might be using brakes. And they've started to use throttles that more closely simulate a locomotive's control panel. So this is a little bit bigger, heavier, requires both hands, and it's a great scheme when you've got separate locomotive engineers and conductors on a train. So with a 2-person crew, the locomotive's hands and eyes are pretty well occupied with this prototypical throttle, and the conductor is free to concern himself with car cards or switch lists and moving cars around. where the engineer is focused on the locomotive. So we've got some great new options in this area, and this is something I think will become a bigger part of the hobby. So we've covered some of the high points and hopefully demystified a little bit of the jargon in the model railroad's sub-hobby of operation. And again, operation is modeling the things the railroad does, the jobs of the railroad, the operations of the railroad, I guess the business of the railroad. And we've given you a little bit of a glimpse into some of those things today. Hope you'll come back and join us for another TSG video showing a little more detail on some of these things.
All right, thanks so much, Seth. That was a lot of really great information. Your time and generosity sharing your knowledge is really appreciated. So as you can see, there's quite a bit to learn if this is an aspect of the hobby that you want to explore. You can learn a lot about operations by going to OPSIG.org. OPSIG is the Operations Special Interest Group. They have members all over the world who come together to discuss and share ideas about how to realistically operate layouts. They not only have a website, but they also have a quarterly publication. They put on events, and they even published this book, which is a pretty thick book with a lot of info. Since this is an introduction to operations, the intention here today was to cover the basics in a way that provides a better understanding of some of the operating styles that you can choose from. In the coming months, we'll dive a little deeper into some of the various styles that Seth mentioned today. If you have an idea for a Model Railroading 101 topic, please put a comment below and subscribe now so that you don't miss anything. Also, did you know that you can help me promote the hobby by supporting the channel on Patreon? Go to patreon.com/tsgmultimedia to learn how you can help for as little as 7 cents a day. Thanks for watching and make it a great day.
They don't go around curse words.
I was already thinking about that.